Alright folks, here we are. We are in the last topic of period 4, topic 4.13, the Society of the South in the Early Republic. So this will be a great continuation of what we were looking at in the last video. And let's look at Southern society on the, as we head towards the Civil War, what's going on in the South. So what factors are going to shape the development of the South from 1800 to 1848? That's our guiding question. And let's begin by looking at King Cotton, which is a term we use to describe the importance of cotton to the southern economy, where it really did dominate the southern economy and played a role of guiding the South forward. Now, if we look at our diagram here, you'll notice that cotton, as we began this century, was not exactly a giant product of the South. It was relatively minor. And then there's kind of a steady, slight rises here, and then about 1815 or so, we notice a pretty rapid rise, and then a giant rise here as we get into 1860, right before the Civil War. We notice our production of cotton has skyrocketed compared to 1800. You can also see the states that are most heavily involved in this production. So, for example, Virginia was, and then they're not. But then states that really didn't produce a lot began to produce a lot. And this reflects the westward migration of slavery primarily. All right, so if cotton takes off, we have to kind of point to a particular invention that would have increased these cotton profits and therefore motivated people to grow more cotton. And that, of course, is Eli Whitney's cotton gin. So with the cotton gin, we have greater profits than ever with cotton, which allows growers of cotton to buy more land and to purchase more slaves. That allows them to grow more cotton, which gives them more profit, which allows them to buy more land, and we have this economic spiral that the South is going through in the first half of the 1800s. We looked at a map similar to this in our last video. Here we are looking at the increase in cotton production and also population of slaves. As we go through the middle of the 1800s, slavery is moving westward, and we have this really noticeable pattern here of cotton production right through here. The so-called black belt, slave belt, cotton belt. There's different terms we could use for that area. Now, the North, of course, also benefited from the cotton production of the South. So northern shippers would pick up the cotton. They would then sell it in England or in northern textile mills to buy manufactured goods, which can be sold back in America, particularly in the South. And then, of course, the process repeats itself. So by 1840, this is 20 years out from the Civil War, half the value of all American exports were made up of cotton, which is really astounding to think about. One particular product being valued over half the value of all exports from America. And by the time we get to 1860, you can see that in fact it's even greater. Nearly 60% of all American exports in terms of dollar value was cotton. Some 75% of all Britain's cotton came from the South, and about 20% of all British people were employed in the textile mills, in the textile industry. And so the South was confident that if a war were to break out or the South were to challenge the North, that Britain, out of just economic survival, would have no choice but to step in and protect the South, to protect their cotton supply. All right, now let's look a little bit at the Society of the South. We focused heavily on African Americans in our last video, and so this video we're going to focus more on the white population of the South and try to figure out, what different social classes there were and how that affects the development of the South. So the question we have in front of us is about what fraction of white Southerners owned slaves or belonged to a slave-owning family. And this is a fraction I think that sometimes surprises people. The fraction is about 1/4. So about 1/4 of all white Southerners either owned slaves or belonged to a slave-owning family. So 3/4 then did not. Now, owning slaves, though, was incredibly expensive, and so there were only a relatively small group that could have owned dozens or more than 100 slaves. So as we look at this breakdown, we have the majority of slave owners only own 1, 2, 3, 4 slaves. There's only a small group at the top that own a lot, but these are the people who have the most power and influence in Southern society. They sort of guide and rule over the so-called Cotnocracy. The Cotnocracy is this oligarchy of the South of rich planters who have outsized influence over the entire South. These great planters lived in large plantation homes, owning hundreds, if not thousands of acres, dozens, if not more than 100 or so slaves. And they certainly gave off the impression of being very wealthy because they lived in these giant homes and owned all this land and everything. But in reality, a lot of planters were in fact deeply in debt, many of them to northern bankers. Because as it turns out, the slave system, economically speaking, just is not very efficient. Slaves, if you think of them as an investment, as white Southerners would have, it was a very big and very risky investment because slaves can run away, they can get injured, they can get sick, they can get, they can work more slowly than you're expecting them to. There's all kinds of problems where the slaves are just not a stable economic platform to run an economy. Here's a very interesting map of plantations along the Mississippi River, and you'll notice how they're arranged. All the plantations want, of course, access to the river to be able to export and import things. And so you have these plantations that are very, very long, but also very narrow in terms of width. All right, let's look at our what we might call small slave owners. In other words, they only own a handful of slaves. This would be the majority of slave owners. These people are not wealthy enough to where they can just simply sit back and let the slaves do all the work. In most cases, these people would also be in the fields, they and their family working alongside the slaves to grow the crops and do the work. And then you have what we're going to call subsistence farmers. So this would be about 3/4 of all Southern whites who own no slaves, who don't live on prime land. They often live kind of out in the frontier or mountain valleys, just barely able to scrape by. They don't raise cotton. They raise animals and food for their subsistence. In other words, just their basic needs. They don't like the rich planters very much. They resent them for having so much power and control over the economy. They, this is human nature, right? People at the bottom always look at the top with jealousy and desire that they want what the top has, and they resent the top for not giving it to the bottom. Now, at the very, very bottom of that white subsistence farmer group would have been the poorest of the poor. They were referred to as poor white trash, which of course is not a very politically correct term to use in our time period, but that was a term they would have used back then. These people would have been called hillbillies. They were seen as just absolute kind of bottom feeders. They lived just very sad lives. Many of them are malnourished because of their poverty. Most of them don't actually own any land. They just kind of they're hired out, so they might live in a shack or maybe live in a barn or something temporarily. It is just a really difficult life. Again, they're often sickly because of their malnourishment, and they're looked down upon as being kind of lazy and just an underclass that needs to be kind of ignored, basically. So as we've looked at the maps, we've noticed that the distribution of slavery across the South is not even. It's concentrated in certain areas and less so than in other areas. And I want you to think about the geography of the South and the area of the South. Where would slavery be least common? And I keep saying geography for a reason. Here we are looking at a map of the South, and we'll notice concentration of enslaved African Americans, 1850. You'll notice there are few slaves out here. This is largely because it's kind of frontier territory. It's not been heavily settled yet. Also, in some of these areas, it's just not good for cash crop farming. But you'll also notice this big gap right here, and this, of course, would be the Appalachian Mountains. So this would bring us to our final group of the South. We're going to refer to these people as mountain whites. And mountain whites tended to be farmers who are, on the poor end of things. They tend to live in mountainous, rugged terrain where cash crop farming is just not a viable option. Very few slaves living in this part of the South. There's a lot of dislike and flat-out hatred for the wealthy planters and their slaves as well. And the man we have at the bottom would be Andrew Johnson, future President of the United States. He was from Eastern Tennessee. The rugged terrain of Eastern Tennessee, not good for cash crop farming, not a lot of enslaved people, and many of the people in Eastern Tennessee would in fact remain loyal to the Union during the Civil War, like Andrew Johnson himself. Again, you can see the lack of enslaved people right through here. Alright, now let's look at defenses of slavery. So, how do you defend the indefensible? What would be typical arguments in favor of slavery? And also, let's think about the 3/4 of white Southerners who don't own slaves. Why would they defend slavery, either through rhetoric or during the Civil War through actual action of fighting in a war to protect slavery? So there's a couple of reasons. Number one, of course, is just economics. That maybe one day, if things improve, I can, if I'm a poor white Southern farmer, maybe I can scrape together enough money to purchase a slave, and that slave will kind of unlock the door to upward social mobility. I'll get more respect in the community. I'll have more money. Things will improve. So there's kind of a hope for a better future through slavery. Would have been one of the reasons white Southerners who didn't own slaves would have defended slavery so harshly. There's also the feeling of superiority, that no matter how poor I am, no matter how difficult my life is, I still am white, and therefore I am better than non-whites. And so that belief in racial superiority would have given these people something to defend, because if you take that away, if there is no enslaved class, then all of a sudden they really are at the bottom of the ladder, and no one wants to be at the bottom of the ladder. Other defenses of slavery would have been using the Bible to say that slavery exists in the Bible and it's biblical, and therefore we're doing God's work here. Others would claim that in fact slavery is good for the slaves, because this goes back to the idea of seeing African Americans as inferior and not being on the same level as white Americans. Therefore, they need to be kind of controlled. There's also this idea that that slavery itself is not the harsh, brutal system that we think of it as, but instead it would have been almost like this familial relationship where the master and slave are almost like parent and child. Now, of course, this is obviously not true, but it's, again, if you a white Southerner, it's something you can point to say, well, okay, what I'm doing is really not actually all that immoral. The other defense here is basically, well, what else can we do? So if you were born in 1850, slavery had been a part of American, economy and society for 2 centuries now, 2.5 centuries. What else can we do? If slavery were to end, what would we even do with the former slaves? So basically, since we don't have a better solution, let's just keep doing what we're doing. That would have been another defense of slavery. All right, here's some really awful propaganda depicting slaves, in their native Africa as being sort of barbaric, and there's death everywhere. And then here in America, they're being treated well, and they're getting civilization, as they would have called it back then. All right, so guys, we looked at some factors that shaped the development of the South. We looked at the different social classes. We looked at the effect of slavery on developing the Cotnocracy, and we looked at the effect of the spread of slavery further west. We looked at how plantations worked, We talked about sort of the small slave-holding classes, the white majority who did not own slaves. We looked at all these different groups and how they're interacting and helping to develop a South that is definitely unique from the rest of the Union, and so unique, in fact, that of course, as we get to the mid-1800s, many in the South are seeing their continued existence in the Union as basically, well, not sustainable. They have to go their separate way.